Why did Conan even pass you in a hallway? Where were you and why did you get there?
Well, you know what? Honestly, the first time we met or that we were around each other, as far as we can tell, was at Bob Odenkirk's house here in Los Angeles. Bob Odenkirk had an apartment. He was living here in Los Angeles. He was engaged to a woman with whom I had been on an improv team back in Chicago. And I don't think they ever married. But he had a party at his house, and my old friend Kate Flannery, who's been on The Office, and who I did my first improv class with, she brought me to Bob's. And I had met Bob because I had been on the improv team with his fiance. And it was years later that Conan and I figured out we were at this same yard party together with about 20 people total, but just hadn't,
right,
either clocked each other or talked to each other because we didn't know each other. But we had plenty of people overlapping, which is how we met in the first place. I did improv in Chicago, was in New York doing a live show. A couple of friends of mine had been on SNL, and through them, I met Robert Smigel.
Right.
And Robert and I hit it off, but just in like a social sort of way. Then I was in LA because this show had moved from New York to LA. And in the summertime, off of SNL, where Robert was writing, he came out here to work on the ill-fated Hans and Franz movie, and was working on that. And he and I hung out together and would, just sort of socialize and hang out and got to know each other. And then that show ended. I was back out here. I was doing the movie Cabin Boy, which I had auditioned for before I left LA. And then I got the part and was back here. And I got a call from Robert out of the blue. And he said, and I had heard about this guy, Conan O'Brien, that was going to replace David Letterman. And in fact, with Kate Flannery, we had gone to see Jeff Garlin tape a pilot, a multi-camera show that he was taping a pilot. And I sat in front of Bob Odenkirk and Carol Leifer, who I am interviewing later today, small world. And I just eavesdropped on them talk about Conan O'Brien and how he got the job. And because Bob was friends with Conan and had been part of that process. So I had that in my head already. He said, and Robert calls and says, yeah, I'm going to be writing this show with Conan. Do you want to meet him and maybe, be a writer on the show? And there will be room for performers too. So we're going to hire writers who also perform. And I said, sure. So we met at Junior's Deli and had lunch and hit it off immediately. And I immediately knew, like, I just, it's like in comedy, and it would happen a lot on the Conan show, where there's somebody, especially if you know their work, and they sit down and you can just, like with my wife, I can just be myself and I can just say the dumbest, stupidest, most, the sort of thing that would off-put any civilian. Right. But with a comedy person, it's like, hey, do you speak the code of dumbness? And they go, yes, I do. and then you're off and running. And he and I were like that immediately. We hit it off right away, and we just were silly and funny together the way we have been for 30 plus years. And apparently he called Robert right afterwards and said, hire him. And Robert said, well, let's see, let him write a packet first. So I sat down and wrote a packet of, a packet of ideas. Like, hey, okay, we're doing a late night show. So here's some jokes, some monologue jokes. I was given, do monologue jokes, desk bit, character bits, just, whatever you think you would see in it. And, and they don't teach that in school. You just kind of, being a David Letterman fan, think like, well, okay, I want to do some stuff, but also with the caveat of it not being too Letterman-y. That was one of our main directives, was that we were...
And just what word would that be to use to describe that?
Well, you know what? It would be sort of... a word that I would use to describe that?
Letterman-ish.
Yeah, kind of an ironic detachment.
Right.
Or,
That's great, actually. Yeah.
Or also too, like, anything with a sort of a Larry Bud Melman, sort of a non-performer sort of thing. It was, we had a better idea of it. And honestly, you wouldn't know it until you saw it. We would come up with bits in the early days of the show and go, oh, that sounds really Letterman-y. And we'd be like, yeah, you know what, it does. And in fact, going out into the field and doing remote bits, which is what it's called when you go out and do something in the field, I was the first one to do those because we were so afraid of Conan going out and doing them and it seeming like an approximation of Dave going out into the field and giving, gift baskets to RCA executives or whatever. So I would go out and do it because I was like one step removed from being Letterman-y. And I submitted some material. I don't even really remember much, but it was good enough. And I was the first writer hired. And I was living in a furnished apartment in Westwood at the time. And I packed up what belongings I had into my Toyota pickup. And I drove them up to my fiance, who was living in San Francisco. And left her with my truck and all the stuff. Never saw the truck again. It got passed on to, a bunch of different deadbeat friends. Lost all my LPs, all my records, just scattered to the winds. And moved to New York and started on the Conan show. And it was a big empty floor, the 9th floor, 9 West on Rockefeller Center. And he had a corner office and Jeff Ross had a corner office. And then Robert had another corner. There were 3 corners and Robert had another one. And then I was just given, probably 30 empty offices. Pick one. And I went in and I took the one that was next to Conan because I kind of just felt like, well.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah, that's why I'm here. And feels lonely, and it overlooked 6th Avenue. It was a nice office. It was kind of one of the bigger ones. And I shared it with a guy named Marsh McCall for probably the first, 3 or 4 years that I was there. I didn't, and then when he got another, he became the head writer. And when he was a head writer for about a year, then I got to keep my office, just my office. And I got a couch instead of a different desk.
And this is before you were up and running?
Yes.
The show?
I got there in, I think, it might have been June. And the show wasn't on until September. So, and then my first job was to go through a stack and it was probably about 18 inches high of packets of material of the same thing that I had submitted, and to help winnow through these, trying to find a writer. And I was I was given the directive to have high standards, which I did anyway, and which I had no right to, but I did I had pretty good taste. I knew what I wanted this show to be. And if I saw stuff that I found to be boring or sort of derivative of other things that I had seen before, I chucked it. And I think of that stack, I think I came out with 2.
Wow. Did they make the show?
Marsh did. Actually, one of them was the guy that ended up being my office mate, Marsh. I pulled his packet, and then the other guy, I don't think so. I don't remember what happened.
How soon before you were on camera?
When the test show started, that was again a gradual process, and they started just putting him in front of cameras because we were in Studio 6A, and 8H is where SNL was, and they used to send Conan to 8H for camera tests, and they would put him on just whatever set happened to be there. Bob Costas had a late talk show called Later, that it was just 2 chairs facing each other. And the first thing they did was have Conan sit on Bob Costas' set because it was already set up and lit. And and it was just lots of technical stuff to see what his lighting looked like, what his makeup looked like. And also too, to just get him in front of camera, I think, just to have the sense that you got to, get out on the ball field and just play around before you actually have a game. And from that first time, I was in my office, and we always had the feed up from whatever was happening down on the floor at all the TVs in all the offices. And Robert called me and said, "Hey, will you go downstairs and just keep him company?" Which I understood, because Conan needs company. He runs on a high RPM. So he needs, it's like, keep him in one place. Now that I have children that are, run on high RPMs, it's like, you got to keep them occupied, or else something bad's going to happen. So I went down and I sat across from him, and we just, shot the shit like we always did. And also by that time too, we had a rapport around the office.
Yeah.
We were doing bits naturally together, probably to a greater extent than he was doing with other writers on the show.
Right.
And then from that point on, every time he did, then the next one was he interviewed a staff member on a fake talk show set. And I was told, go down and sit there, because there's a lot of downtime too. So just keep him occupied, keep him laughing, keep him happy, because he also would get antsy, and get like, what's taking so long, and let's keep going. And then there, had a chef come in with a cooking demonstration, and I, stand there with him during that.
So they knew what they were doing.
I didn't.
Putting you in. Yeah.
I just was. I'm very easy to fool. I take things at face value. Because I didn't understand. I'm serving a role here. And then one day before our real first test show with an audience, Robert said, came into my office and said, "Would you like to be the sidekick?" And at that time too, we had these romantic ideas that the show would be as much a talk show as it was, or a sketch show as it was a talk show. That we'd have sort of this Steve Allen-ish, cast of characters that would be the Conan troupe, the Conan players or whatever. And I said, well, I don't know, maybe I'd rather sort of be available to do other bits rather than just be kind of stuck on the couch next to him for the whole thing. And he said, well, think about it. And I also was sort of like, I said, I got to talk to my fiance about it and see, talk to her about it.
Fiance who gave your records away, that one?
She didn't give them away. I think she wasn't, maybe not. I mean, what are you going to do? 1,500 albums. You're going to leave. You're not going to take them on the plane. But the minute he left my office, like 2 seconds later, I was like, who the fuck am I kidding? Like, he just said, do you want to be on TV every night? And I'm going to demur. I'm going to go, well, I don't know.
I don't know about sidekick.
I don't know about being on TV every night. So I just called my fiance, my ex-wife, and I told her, I'm going to be the sidekick on the show, I guess. And then we did a number of test shows for about 2 weeks. And they bought me like 2 sport coats, and I wore a bunch of ties from the SNL,
right.
The wardrobe vault. And there was one night after about 4 or 5 test shows where Jeff Ross said to us,
"This is full audience.
This is full audience. Yeah. Mickey Rooney as a guest.
Ooh.
Yeah. And Al Roker probably 3 times.
Yeah.
And before one of the shows, I think it was the last test show, Jeff Ross said, you guys keep your show clothes on, because you're going to go to dinner with Lorne afterwards, because Lorne was our executive producer. And so we did. We got in Lorne's car, and they drove us to a fancy restaurant and on the East Side. And we walked in, and they showed us to a table, and there was Lorne and Steve Martin at this table. Which I was
sure.
Oh boy! And it was my first experience of just sitting and not saying much, like only speaking when spoken to, and just sort of soaking it up. And then the next day after that dinner, and I mean, I did talk. There was some conversation, but mostly, it's Lorne and Steve talking. And the next day, Jeff Ross said, well, I guess you're going to be the sidekick. And I was like, oh, I thought I already was the sidekick.
Yeah.
I guess I passed a test I didn't know I was taking. So, and then it went from there,